as Dee indicated, I am going to be your session moderator for this first plenary session. Most of you probably know me in the context of ag safety and health. I've been at USDA since '89 and with Extension Service and CSRS and now NIFA. And that's been a major, one of my programs that I've worked on in that period. Some of you may know me as far back as when I was an extension specialist in Arizona and Nebraska, also working in ag safety and health. One of the things we are excited to have a room full of some of the key stakeholders and representatives from the various organizations, education, and research disciplines. The purpose of this session is really to provide a brief overview of safety in agriculture for youth since the beginning of the 20th century. Key events often occurred in the same time period. This session will highlight those events and will be presented by key organizations representatives. While they will be presenting their organization programs and initiatives, I think it's important to note youth agricultural safety and health is a relatively small community of stakeholders, and these individuals most often involve the collaboration of most, if not all, of those organizations over a span of many years. Go to the next slide. As Dee mentioned, we're going to be starting back near the beginning. In the early years, ag safety and health at the turn of the century with the American industry safety and health movement. This era came shortly after the Industrial Revolution, where countless numbers of individuals were injured and killed in their highly mechanized workplaces. Just like what was happening in the cities with increase in manufacturing industries, the farm was becoming mechanized with numerous injuries and fatalities. There was a national need for the agricultural safety, American Safety Institute and health movement to address this high rate of injuries. The country's first workers' compensation policy was put in place and was noticeable different from England's replicated common law that our country continued to practice. However, the passage of the 1911 workers' compensation law did not include agriculture. And the exclusion is important to note. Many of today's production agricultural activities are exempt or excluded in some manner. The Roaring '20s saw workplace injuries continue to grow in exponential numbers. Several constitutional amendments tried to counter this increase. Look briefly at the proposed child labor amendment of 1924. This act would have applied to agriculture, but failed ratification by 8 states. To date, this proposed amendment has only been ratified by 28 of the 38 states needed for final ratification. Under the Sugar Act, growers had to agree not to employ children under 14 years of age, and less than 16 could not work more than 8 hours per day to be eligible for benefits. This act actually expired 10 years after its adoption. In June 1938, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed 21 bills 9 days after Congress had adjourned. Among these bills was a landmark law in the nation's social and economic development, the Fair Labor Standards Act. In certain industries, this act banned oppressive child labor and set the minimum hourly wage at 25 cents per hour and the maximum work week at 44 hours. The federal child labor provisions authorized by the FLSA in 1938 were enacted to ensure when young people work, the work is safe and does not jeopardize their health, well-being, or educational opportunities. Established in 1914 and chartered by the U.S. Congress, delegates of the Second National Safety Congress formed the National Council for Industrial Safety as a clearinghouse of information available for all concerned with industrial safety. 1 year later, becoming the National Safety Council, when adding transportation safety and other non-industry specific safety issues. National Safety Council meetings in 1936 consisted of individuals from state departments of agriculture, farm organizations, U.S. Department of Agriculture, publishers of farm papers and magazines, and others associated with farming were encouraged by the National Safety Council to form a farm safety program. The first national meeting of volunteers was the following year in 1937. Several of the speakers spoke on the need for a greater effort toward farm safety. A recommendation was forwarded to NSC to establish a permanent and comprehensive program that addressed incidents occurring to farm people. The first National Home and Farm Safety Conference was in Chicago, and by 1944, funding was appropriated and a separate farm division was formed. And in 1994, I led a committee of the Agricultural Division of the NSC to develop a position statement on childhood risks involving tractors. The driver for this statement was the advent of the training seat in tractors. The council recognized that this could invite youth as passengers and increase exposure of youth to safety and health risks associated with riding on tractors. Jumping ahead to the 1980s, the National Safety Council report showed prevention efforts were not making a significant progress. And National Safety Council draws its data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And rates were becoming higher in any time in history. And actually, I think in that period is when it jumped ahead of the mining industry. State extension programs, and I was a recipient of these both as a person who received those in the land grant system, as well as I went into DC, I became the administrator of those programs. Those funds went back to basically being funded first in 1975. It was about $20,000 a year, which was enough to pay for a full-time person, but that funding level never increased. So consequently, its effectiveness in terms of what could be done programmatically decreased over time. Some states contributed significantly in other ways, others did not. In 1989, we'll talk more about this later, there's a National Coalition for Ag Safety published, Agriculture at Risk, a report to the nation. And U.S. Congress appropriated $12.2 million for ag safety education surveillance through the National Safety Council. through the National Institute of Occupational Safety. Youth industries notably were noticeably documented and were getting the attention of many. There was a number of agricultural publications that began to be issued to draw attention to the issue. The Des Moines Register publication, Harvest of Harm. Successful Farming wrote several articles. There were progressive farmer series, Deadly Harvest. And if you go through those, these were very powerful images and basically articles that talked about the implications and basically the consequences of these injuries and fatalities to youth. And I think one of the last ones we're looking at here was published in 1990 by a progressive farmer, father recalling the events leading up to a moment of weakness in 1989. After begging for a ride, the father finally gave in and allowed 3 of his children to ride on a tractor while he was mowing. Fender broke off and one of the young lives was lost in the instance. As recorded by Dennis Murphy in his book Safety and Health for Production Agriculture, a key event that focused on mobilized medical and public health professionals, focused on mobilizing medical and public health professionals interested in farm safety and health was the 1988 4-part conference entitled Agricultural, Occupational, and Environmental Health, Policy Strategies for the Future. The 4 parts of this conference included grassroots input into the conference, a technical workshop, a policy workshop, and a public forum. The conference was sponsored by the Institute of Agricultural Medicine and Occupational Health. The National Coalition for Agricultural Safety and Health, NCASH, was born during this conference, and a publication, Agriculture at Risk, a report to the nation, was produced. Next slide. We've already touched on a couple of these. Again, we mentioned that the Congress appropriated funds to NIOSH. That funding increased up to about $18.2 million. I think it's important to note that NIOSH put out mostly competitive grants as well as some internal types of operations. But I know the Extension Service was a recipient through one of the earlier programs, the Ag program, that was actually, I think it was managed by David Hart, who's in our audience. In the 90s, we saw many efforts to focus on children in agriculture and the workplace, and there was the development then of the formation of the National Safety Council. When we go to the Surgeon General's Conference, other key events included the Conference on Production of Ag Safety and Health. This was convened by the Surgeon General of the U.S. Public Health Service, Antonio Novello, and the theme was the Farm Safety 2000. So what some of you know, but some of you may not know, is this was the first Surgeon General's Conference since 1942, when they addressed the Mad Hatter disease. So a Surgeon General's conference was a very big deal. The influence of the conference theme and the message conveyed by the Surgeon General and her representatives was that the U.S. Public Health Service would play an active role in agricultural safety and health issues for the next several years. In 1996, more than 500 individuals and organizations outside of the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health gathered to answer the question, what will the workplace of 2006 look like? The result of this key event was the National Occupational Research Agenda, which for the next decade would become a roadmap for those in the workplace safety and health community. Stakeholders identified 21 priority research areas and formed 20 teams to address these topics. At the NIOSH Symposium 2006, NIOSH and its partners reflected on the success of these partnerships. In 2007, I think this is actually, it wasn't a task force. This is the result of multi-state committee activities that started in 1998. I'm sorry, go back to the last slide. The USDA created, actually under my influence, we actually got we have what we call multi-state committee activities, which actually supports certain priority areas and focus areas throughout the land grant system. These are basically authorized by the experiment station and extension directors, and in 1998 one was formed for the first time around agricultural safety and health. As a result of that, they developed a national research agenda for the land grant systems, and they have also various milestones throughout that were developing, looking at different white papers and activities to support some of these, what they call some of the priority areas. And one of the ones they addressed was movement of agricultural equipment on farm roads, and then the one after that was really confined space, in which they did a lot of work in terms of pulling together the research that had been done and working with different organizations, both federal and state and nonprofit organizations, to really, what can we do to address confined space issues. In 2007, the white paper was, again, the 12 focus areas. That was actually a little earlier. The ag equipment on public roads was one, the confined space, as I mentioned, and then the NIOSH funding for 10 ag centers was, again, released in 2014. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Lee.